Dad Perfect Revents. My name is Gerald Holt. I'm 65 years old. I own 8 rental properties and 2 commercial units scattered across the Phoenix metro area, worth somewhere around $9 and $5 million at current market. My wife's kids spent 18 months trying to figure that out. They never did. And I want to tell you exactly how that played out. Because if you're in a similar situation, some of this might save you a serious headache. It started on a Tuesday morning in November. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the way I do every morning, up at 5 a.m., coffee black, no TV, just the quiet before the day kicks in. Diane was still asleep upstairs. Through the sliding glass door, I could see the backyard, the desert landscaping starting to take shape in the gray light, the saguaro we planted along the back wall casting long shadows across the gravel. It was the kind of morning I'd come to appreciate. No noise, no demands, just the sound of the neighborhood waking up slow. Then my phone buzzed on the table. A text from Roy Dalton, one of my tenants over at the temp unit on McClintock. Roy had been renting from me for 6 years. Reliable guy, never late, always gave me a heads up when something needed fixing before it turned into a problem. His text said, "Hey Gerald, just wanted to give you a heads up. A woman named Melissa called me yesterday afternoon, said she was a mortgage consultant and wanted to talk about refinancing options on the property. Thought you should know before anything else happened." I set my coffee mug down, read it again, slower. Melissa, my wife Deaney's daughter. 37 years old, mortgage broker out of Scottsdale. She had called one of my tenants, a tenant she had no business knowing existed, to dig for information about a property she wasn't supposed to know I owned. I didn't call Roy back right away. Didn't go upstairs and wake Diane. Just sat there in the kitchen with my coffee going cold and thought it through. The sun was starting to come up over the superstitions, throwing that orange light through the glass door the way it does in November. I sat with it for a good 15 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and texted Roger Stanton, my attorney. "Call me when you're in the office." Some things developed. That was the morning the whole thing shifted from suspicion to evidence. But to explain why it mattered, I need to back up and tell you how I got here. I grew up in East Phoenix. My father spent 22 years welding pipe fittings at a factory on 27th Avenue, same shift, same floor, same parking spot. My mother worked a register at a Fry's grocery store on Thomas Road. We weren't broke in any dramatic way. There was food, there was a roof, we had what we needed, but money was a low-grade pressure that never went away in that house. I remember hearing my parents talk at the kitchen table after they thought we were asleep, voices low, running through the numbers. Electric bill, car payment. School clothes, always something that needed to be covered and not quite enough to cover it clean. I made a decision around age 14 that I wasn't going to spend my life in that arithmetic. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do instead, but I knew I was going to do something different. I put myself through Arizona State on loans and part-time work. Studied civil engineering. Spent 12 years in construction management after that, site work, project coordination out in 108-degree Phoenix heat, arguing with subcontractors about schedules and concrete pours. Good money, hard work, but not the kind of money that builds anything lasting. At 34, I bought my first rental property. A duplex in Glendale, beat up, sellers were motivated to move it. I put in the work myself on weekends, new flooring, repainted everything, fixed the plumbing issues that the inspection flagged. Both units rented within 3 weeks of listing. That first month, I collected $1,450 in combined rent. I remember sitting at my desk looking at that deposit and thinking, this is a different language. Money that came in while I was at my regular job. Money that didn't require me to trade another hour of my time for it. I was hooked from that moment. I lived tight for years after that. Drove old trucks, didn't take vacations, put every dollar of rental income back into the next purchase. Bought another property 3 years later, another 2 years after that. I was methodical about it. No over-leveraging, no creative financing schemes that could blow up in a down market. Just patient, careful accumulation the way my father stacked overtime hours, except the math eventually got significantly better. By the time I was in my mid-50s, the portfolio was largely running itself. I still managed everything personally. I've always trusted my own systems over anyone else's. My first wife, Linda, was with me through all of it. She never had much interest in the financial mechanics, but she understood what I was building, and she gave me the space to build it. Good marriage, 31 years. We were a real team. She died of ovarian cancer 4 years ago, 18 months from first diagnosis to the end. That first year without her, I kept the lights on and not much else. And my son Perry, who lives in Denver and works as an architect, called every Sunday. Those calls mattered more than he probably knows. But grief moves on its own schedule. You just keep walking through it until you come out the other side. By the time I found my footing again, I was 61 years old, living alone in a 4-bedroom house in North Scottsdale that echoed in the evenings and not entirely sure what came next. I met Diane at a charity fundraiser dinner in Scottsdale in February, about 2 years ago. It was one of those events I almost didn't go to. A friend had an extra ticket, called me the afternoon of, and I said yes, mostly because sitting home that Friday felt worse than putting on a sport coat and making conversation with strangers. Diane was at the same table. She was 60, recently widowed, had been a middle school science teacher for 27 years before retiring. We ended up talking through the entire dinner and then kept talking after the plates were cleared and the room started emptying out. She was easy to be around in a way that's hard to describe. No performance, no agenda, just a woman who'd had a full life and a hard loss and was figuring out what the next chapter looked like. We talked about our kids, our late spouses, what we missed most about having someone in the house. She said she missed having someone to share a meal with. I told her I missed morning coffee with another person across the table. Small things, the honest ones. We exchanged numbers that night. Started meeting for coffee the following week, then dinners, then day trips up to Sedona and Jerome. I introduced her to Perry on a video call about 4 months in. She met him in person when he came down for Thanksgiving. He pulled me aside before dinner and said quietly, "She's good, Dad. I like her." That was enough for me. 14 months after that fundraiser, we got married. Small ceremony at a friend's property in Paradise Valley. Maybe 30 people. Outdoor setting, string lights in the trees, nothing elaborate. Perry flew in from Denver. Diane's 2 kids came from the valley. Melissa from Scottsdale, Leonard from Tempe. Both of them were cordial, warm even. Melissa hugged me at the reception and said she was happy her mom had found someone. Leonard shook my hand firmly and said, "Welcome to the family, Gerald." I took it at face value. People mean what they say until they don't. That goodwill lasted about 3 weeks. The first flag went up at a Sunday brunch the family had at Diane's old house in Chandler, which she still owned and used as a gathering spot. Casual afternoon, good weather, everyone out on the back patio. Melissa had brought her boyfriend, some guy in finance, and the conversation moved naturally to markets and property values and what the Phoenix corridor was doing. At some point, she turned to me directly and said, "So, Gerald, how many properties do you manage?" "Mom mentioned you do rentals." I said, "A few. Residential or commercial?" "Bit of both." She nodded and moved on, but I noticed the quality of the question. It wasn't the question of someone making conversation. It was the question of someone filling in a form. 2 weeks later, Leonard called me on a Tuesday evening. He said he'd been thinking as an attorney who dealt with estate planning that blended families could get complicated if things weren't structured correctly from the start. He wasn't trying to overstep, he just wanted to make sure his mother was protected. He offered to review whatever will or trust structure I had in place. No charge, of course, family. I told him I had a solid attorney who handled everything and it was all properly structured. He said that was great, of course, just wanted to offer. We hung up friendly. A month after that, Melissa emailed me 3 articles about rental property tax strategies. The subject line said, "Thought these might be useful." I replied, "Thanks, Melissa, appreciate you thinking of me." Gave her nothing. The pattern continued like that for months. Always polite, always framed as helpful, always looking for a foothold. At Thanksgiving dinner 8 months into the marriage, Leonard mentioned over the turkey that he had clients who'd restructured their holdings into LLCs and seen significant tax advantages. Had I looked into that approach? At Christmas, Melissa asked whether I'd ever considered bringing on a business partner, someone with her lending connections could really help grow a residential portfolio. At a birthday dinner for Diane in March, Leonard brought up succession planning, said he saw blended family estates get contested all the time, and it was always the ones that weren't structured clearly that caused problems. Diane would shift in her seat when these moments came up. She'd redirect the conversation, ask someone about their work, top off a wine glass. She knew it was uncomfortable. What she didn't fully understand yet was that it was also coordinated. Meanwhile, I was watching and saying very little. I know what it looks like when someone is building a case. I spent 12 years in construction management. You learn to read what a project is actually doing underneath what people say it's doing. Melissa and Leonard were running an assessment. They were trying to determine what I was worth, what Diane was potentially entitled to, and by extension, what they might eventually have a claim to. Every question was a probe. Every offer to help was an attempt to get inside the structure. I didn't confront them. I didn't say anything to Diane that would worry her without cause. I just started keeping notes. Dates, what was said, who said it, the context. A running log in a plain document on my laptop, old habit from project management. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. By month 8, I had enough of a pattern to take to Roger Stanton. Roger Stanton has been my attorney for over a decade. He's 58, works out of a small firm in downtown Phoenix, handles property law and estate planning exclusively. He's the kind of lawyer who doesn't waste words. You tell him what's happening, he tells you what it means and what to do about it. I've always appreciated that. I laid everything out for him over 2 sessions in October. The questions, the offers, the articles Melissa had emailed, Leonard's calls, the timeline. I brought my written log. Roger read through it carefully, asked a few clarifying questions, then leaned back in his chair and said, "Gerald, this is a classic pre-litigation assessment. They're mapping your assets before they decide what move to make. Either they're building toward pushing for a postnuptial agreement, or they're positioning for a future estate challenge. Maybe both." He pulled up my existing trust documents. Everything was already clean. The properties were held in separate, irrevocable trusts established years before I met Diane, structured to pass to Perry and to a charitable remainder trust, with 0 marital asset classification. Diane had lifetime rights to our primary residence in Scottsdale. Legally, Melissa and Leonard had no path in. But Roger said clean documents weren't enough if someone was motivated and willing to spend money on lawyers. We needed to make the walls taller. We spent 2 more sessions tightening the language, added a no contest clause, clarified the separate property documentation with a formal valuation dated prior to the marriage. Roger filed updated paperwork and created a paper trail that would make any future challenge expensive and almost certainly unsuccessful. Then he said, now we wait and see what they do next. I had a different idea in January. We had a family dinner at our place in North Scottsdale. Diane made her green child chicken, the good version she only makes in winter. Everyone was there: Melissa, Leonard, Leonard's girlfriend, a couple of Diane's friends from her teaching years. Good evening, relaxed, nobody fishing for anything obvious. Midway through dinner, between the main course and dessert, I mentioned casually that I'd been looking at a commercial space in Chandler. Corner location near Ray Road. Price had just dropped. The previous tenant had left it in decent shape. I said it the way he'd say anything. Matter of fact, not making a big deal of it, and then I moved on and asked Leonard's girlfriend about the renovation shed mentioned doing on her condo. The property in Chandler did not exist. I had made it up. 10 days later, Diane told me that Melissa had called her that afternoon. During the call, Melissa had asked whether I had found financing yet for the Chandler property. She said she had strong relationships with commercial lenders and could probably get me better terms than whatever I was finding on my own. I listened to Diane tell me this, kept my expression neutral. That confirmed 2 things ID suspected but couldn't prove. First, Melissa was actively tracking everything I said at family gatherings and following up on it. Second, she was using Diane as a source without Diane realizing that's what was happening. Diane wasn't doing anything wrong, she was just talking to her daughter. But Melissa was mining those conversations deliberately. I texted Roger that evening, told him about the Chandler test and what came back. He responded, "Good. Document it. And now we deal with the tenant situation." The tenant situation was Roy Dalton's text from November, the one that started all of this. Melissa had called Roy directly, identified herself as a mortgage consultant, and offered to discuss refinancing options on the property he rented from me. She didn't know Roy would tell me. She probably figured tenants and landlords had arm's-length relationships, and a call from a mortgage professional would just seem like ordinary solicitation. What she didn't account for was that Roy had been renting from me for 6 years and considered the heads up a professional courtesy. Roger drafted a cease and desist letter. It was precise and formal, no emotional language, no accusations beyond what was documented. It laid out the date and nature of Melissa's contact with Roy Dalton, identified it as improper interference with an existing landlord-tenant relationship, and instructed her to make no further contact with any tenant property manager or associate connected to Gerald Holt's real estate holdings. Roger sent it on firm letterhead through certified mail to her office address. Melissa called Diane the same afternoon the letter arrived. I was in the garage doing some maintenance work on the truck when Diane came out, phone in hand, expression unreadable. She said Melissa was upset. She said Melissa felt blindsided and that she had only been trying to help. She said Leonard had also called and used the phrase escalating unnecessarily. I set down the wrench. I said, "Come inside. I want to show you something." We sat at the kitchen table, same table where I'd read Roy's text 4 months earlier. I opened my laptop and pulled up the documents. The trust filings, the property records, the summary Roger's office had prepared when we updated everything in October. I walked Diane through it methodically. All 8 rental properties, the 2 commercial units, the approximate net worth, the legal structure that protected all of it. She sat very still while I talked. When I finished, she looked at the screen for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said this whole time, "Yes. Why didn't you tell me before we got married? Because I needed to know you were with me, not with what I have. If you'd known the full picture going in, every conversation we had would have had this weight to it. Every decision, I didn't want that between us. She was quiet again. I let her sit with it. Then she said Melissa spent 18 months trying to figure out what you were worth. More or less. And the whole time she thought she was investigating the man who married into money. She paused. When it was the other way around, the whole way around, I said. She closed the laptop, looked at me directly. I need to talk to my kids. She made the calls the next morning. I gave her the space to do it, went out early, drove over to check on the Tempe unit, had coffee at a diner on Rural Road I used to go to when I was still working construction. Sat in a corner booth for a while and let the morning pass. When I got home around 11, Diane was in the kitchen. She had made a fresh pot of coffee, which she does when she needs something to do with her hands. She poured me a cup without asking, set it on the counter, and said I talked to both of them. I waited. Melissa cried, said she was just trying to protect me, said she didn't know the letter was coming and it felt like an attack. Diane paused. I told her that when you go around a person's back and call their tenants, you don't get to feel attacked when there are consequences. And Leonard tried to explain that from a legal standpoint, everything Dad done was within normal bounds. She picked up her own coffee. I told him that legal and right aren't always the same thing, and he should know that better than anyone, given his profession. She set the mug down and looked at me. I told them both the same thing, that you are my husband, that your finances are your business and not theirs, and that if either of them approaches your tenants, your properties, or your financial affairs again in any form, they won't be dealing with your attorney. They'll be dealing with mine. I didn't say anything for a moment. You didn't have to do that. I said, yes, I did. She said simply, they're my kids. That means their behavior is also my responsibility to address. That was the moment I understood completely who I had married. Not because she defended me, but because she held her own children accountable without flinching. That's not easy. Anyone who's raised kids knows that. You don't want to see the worst angles of the people you love, and when you do, the easier move is always to look away or explain it down to something softer. Diane didn't do that. She looked at it straight, and she called it what it was. The cease and desist stood. The trust documents stayed exactly as Roger had structured them. We didn't renegotiate anything, didn't offer any concessions, didn't invite Melissa or Leonard into any part of the financial picture. What was mine before the marriage remained mine. What we built together going forward would be handled according to terms agreed on before we ever walked down the aisle. Separate finances, shared household expenses. Diane protected in terms of the residence for as long as she needed it. Everything else structured to pass to Perry and the charitable remainder as intended. Melissa and Leonard attended Diane's birthday dinner 2 months later. Polite, pleasant, nobody brought up property or estate planning or refinancing options. Leonard talked about a case he was working. Melissa showed pictures from a trip shed taken to Colorado. Normal conversation. I was cordial. I've never had a problem being civil with people once the issue is settled, and the issue was settled. Perry came down from Denver for a long weekend in the spring. We grilled steaks on the back patio Friday evening, sat out there past midnight with the temperature finally dropping to something reasonable. I walked him through the whole thing: Roy's text, the fake Chandler property, the cease and desist letter, Deanne's conversations with her kids. He listened without interrupting, which is something he's always been good at. When I finished, he shook his head slowly and said, "Dad, only you would invent a property just to see who took the bait." I said, "You spend 30 years building something. You get a feel for when someone's circling it." He nodded, poured us each another bourbon. Then after a minute, he said, "Linda would have liked Diane." "I think so too," I said. We sat with that for a while. The desert was quiet the way it gets late at night in the valley, not silent exactly, but settled. Somewhere out past the back wall, a coyote was making noise in the wash. The saguaro along the fence line stood black against the sky. I've lived in Phoenix most of my life, and I still think it's one of the better places to sit outside at midnight and think. I'm going to say a few things directly because I think they're worth saying. If you're a man over 55 who's been widowed or divorced and you're thinking about getting married again, or you're already in it, take your finances seriously before anything else changes. Keep them separate. Not because you don't trust the person you're with. Keep them separate because trust is between you and your spouse, and other people's money instincts are their own thing entirely. And those two facts can coexist in the same family without any contradiction. Adult children from previous marriages are not your children. They don't have the history with you, they don't have the loyalty to you, and when it comes to inheritance, they have interests that are directly opposite to yours in a way that no amount of goodwill at a wedding reception is going to change. That's not a character judgment. It's just math. Treat it like math. Document everything. Write down dates. Write down what was said. Write down the context. Sounds like overkill until the day you're sitting in your attorney's office and he asks you for a timeline. Then it's the most useful thing you've done. Talk to a real attorney, not a family member who offers to help for free. Free legal advice from a son-in-law or a stepchild who practices in a related field is not free. There's always a cost to letting someone that close to your financial structure. Pay a professional. Keep it clean. And pay attention to who your spouse chooses when the pressure comes. Because it will come in one form or another. And that moment will tell you more about who you married than any conversation you had over dinner in the early months. When Diane hung up the phone after talking to Melissa and Leonard and told me what she'd said to them, I knew I'd made the right call about her, about waiting, about all of it. I got up this morning at 5 a.m. Same as always. Coffee black, kitchen table, sliding glass door, looking out at the backyard while the neighborhood came to life around me. Diane came downstairs at 6, poured her coffee, sat across from me. We didn't need to say much. That's something you earn with a person over time. The right to sit in the same quiet without it meaning anything except that you're comfortable where you are. Somewhere across this city, I own pieces of it that most people don't know about. 8 rentals, 2 commercial units, 30 years of early mornings and patience and not taking shortcuts. Melissa and Leonard never found what they were looking for. They're not going to. I built it. I know how to hold it. That's the whole story. Some men spend their whole lives building something solid, and the real test isn't whether you can build it. It's whether you're smart enough to protect it when the people smiling at your dinner table are quietly counting what's on the walls. The ones who never found a single number were the ones who thought they were the smartest people in the room. That's the thing about patience. It doesn't look like a weapon until it's already won.